So I hear you want to go to therapy. I am so proud of you. Choosing to seek the right type of help is a huge step on this journey to healing and self-love. So I commend you. It is not an easy thing. I myself have been in therapy for about 2 years now. Crazy to think about. And I think there are very specific reasons as to why I've had such a positive, transformative experience with therapy. And so I wanted to share my tips with you today. Number one, get very specific. So similar to, finding a romantic partner, you don't want to just close your eyes and throw a dart and hopefully get a bullseye. You have to be very specific on the type of energy, person, and circumstance that you want to attract. So I would definitely recommend screenshotting the next page and writing this down after you see this video. Number one, starting as simple as age. Do you want them to be older, younger? For me personally, I wanted them to be young enough to understand my struggles, but older enough to kind of see more stable life advice and see their perspective on the later upcoming stages in my life. So I think that was like a good 30 to 40s range for me. Number two, gender. Are you non-binary? Do you identify as female, male? Those things are super important because I find that the more that you can relate to your therapist, the better the experience will be because there's just less to have to explain. And empathy is at a higher level typically. So for me, I wanted her to be a cisgender female because that is what I identify as. Cultural or culturally sensitive. So I always recommend if you are a person of color or if you are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, person of color, I highly recommend finding a therapist that is also in that realm so that you can relate. And even if they're not of the same full ethnicity, for example, I was looking at a few Chinese American female therapists. I think as close as you can get to your own culture or understanding how culturally sensitive they are is going to help out your experience with them. So I was looking at a few Asian American therapists and I think it was down to 2 Chinese American and then 1 Korean American, and lo and behold, I did end up going with the Korean American therapist. And having someone who just understands your culture or your ethnicity is so amazing because my therapist actually speaks Korean. So when I explained to her, the woes of my day-to-day life, and maybe my mom says something in Korean and it's very hard to translate, she totally gets that and I can actually speak Korean to her or use Korean slang terms, and it's just more detailed and thorough that she can understand me. Sexuality. So if you are part of the LGBTQ community, oh, that was hard for me to say. If you are LGBTQIA+, if you are non-binary, if you are gender non-conforming, I highly recommend finding a therapist that is also part of the same community because I believe trauma is a structure when we live in this world and you can't just simply love yourself out of certain systems and institutions that are discriminating against your identity. So I think it's so important to find a therapist who totally understands that, and what better than to find someone who actually is a part of that community. So there are amazing therapists out there that are part of the LGBTQI+ community that are people of color. We love intersectionality, so I'll get into how you can find that. Political and religious affiliations. So if you grew up in a very religious household but are now more progressive and things like that, or you have more liberal beliefs, it's really important to find a therapist that is in alignment with you. And my therapist was LGBTQI+ aligned. A lot of her politics, as I soon found out through a couple sessions when I spoke about my politics and my beliefs, were we vibing or was she completely on a totally different part of the spectrum? And if you're very conservative and if you grew up in a religious household, I would highly recommend finding a therapist that also is that way as well, because it will be just a lot easier to explain who you are, how you grew up, and things like that. Obviously, we don't talk too much about politics, but it's really important for me to have a therapist that is progressive and more liberal in her beliefs and ideologies, because that's how I see the world, and we're going to butt heads a lot if that's not how we both see the world, I guess. And of course, we have different differing opinions, and politics is not a huge thing that I talk about in therapy, but just for ease and convenience, I think it's good to find a therapist who comes from the similar beliefs or understands like your upbringing. Also, spirituality. For me, it was very important that my therapist works with me on a deeply spiritual level and perspective. So if that's important for you, I would definitely write that down. Specialties. Specialties is important because for me, I knew that I wanted someone who really dealt with millennial mental health in particular, because my job is so current and I do social media for a living. So if I'm going to have to explain what social media is, what an IGDM is, it's just not going to be that fruitful of an experience. I'm going to be wasting a lot of time explaining my job. So it was important that she understood millennial mental health, and also her specialties are eating disorders, anxiety and depression, cultural issues, which is a huge one for me because a lot of my trauma, like many people, is mixed with my cultural beliefs or the culture I was raised on. So it's important to see what they specialize in, and often they'll say it on their website. So definitely read their descriptions and their websites as thoroughly as you can to get a good sense of what they're about and what they can do with and for you. Lastly, when you think about therapy, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all. There are so many different therapists. There are therapists with tattoos, therapists who are young, old, non-binary, part of the LGBTQI+ community. Do you want a therapist that has more of a professorial vibe, a grandma vibe, a close friend vibe, an older sister vibe? That is all really up to you. Do you want someone who's warm and nurturing, someone who smiles a lot, or do you want someone who's very no bullshit, will tell you the way it is? I think for me, personally, I feel like finding a good therapist is really about an intuitive vibe. Do you sense that this person is there to help you? Do you feel like you can trust them? Have you met this energy before? We're all energy, and for me, I knew that when I met my therapist, I was like, this energy is very similar. I have actually met this energy. I can think of two prominent figures in my life that my therapist reminds me of, and that was very significant. And when I asked my friend Raynalyn, who her therapist reminded her of, and she was like, it reminds me of another prominent figure in her life. And so finding a familiar, energetic vibe and connection with your therapist is important. So definitely figure out what kind of vibe. What's the vibe? What kind of vibe you are seeking in a therapist? Someone who's more casual, someone who is young and understands the creative industry. Therapists are simply just people. And I think it's important to acknowledge that while you might not be friends with your therapist, it's important that you mutually respect each other and feel safe and confident in each other's ability to help each other out in this process of healing, unpacking, and growing. So for me, I feel like my therapist has more of a mentor vibe, and I really respect her. I look up to her. I think she's so cool. And would I think we would be friends? I don't know, because she's a lot. I feel like she's older than me. She's in a different age group. But yes, so get specific, write these all down. Also, you on the opposite end of that, I personally think it's good to find someone who can empathize and relate to you really well. But if you find that you would like to heal a certain relationship with someone, you can also find a therapist that's someone that's typically difficult to talk to. So if you have a hard time talking to older men due to past trauma and maybe an abusive history, that can be super healing and transformative in its own different way. I personally haven't taken that route, so can't really say much on that, but that's also another option. Lastly, I want you to remember that your therapist can change at any time you want. It is kind of like dating or finding the right pair of jeans. You might have to try on a few, or sometimes you put on a pair of jeans and you're like, wow, this just really fits well. It flatters my body and I'm comfortable here. So I feel like I personally had the latter experience because I got really specific on who I was trying to attract, and I would recommend looking at 3 to 5 therapists. I had about 3, and then definitely call them. Number 2, cost. How much does therapy cost? How much will it cost me? Therapy is often expensive because of the whole just medical care and mental health system we have here in the States. Specifically, I'm talking about America. Therapy can range from anywhere from $40 to $300 on the higher end. And I think that therapy, while you can totally find therapists in your insurance coverage, most therapists are out of network or out of insurance, I believe. I highly recommend recommend searching for out-of-network therapists because I feel like that is more of a tailored, individualized experience to you, because a lot of the therapists that your insurance might find, it's harder to kind of narrow down, although I'm sure you can still use all of my methods that I said previously for in-network therapists. But I highly recommend paying out of pocket, because I do feel like therapy and therapists are light workers, and the work is healing, the work is important. Everyone who is in the mental health field, I feel like, is here, or just in the health field in general, is here to help the planet evolve and transform. And so I think it's important work. I think they should be paid for it. But if you can't afford it, because I know therapy can be very, very expensive, I highly recommend finding low-cost therapy centers or counseling centers near you. All you have to do is do a quick Google search. I did one for Southern California, and that's how my friend Raina found hers. And a lot of therapists will do it on an income sliding scale, meaning however much you make, they will, tailor that to you. Also, there's also a lot of graduate schools. So when there are already licensed therapists who are trying to get a doctorate or a PhD, a PsyD, they're in school and they have to do a certain amount of hours, and during that time they offer therapy at a lower cost. And I do believe that is how Raina found her therapist. And so there's lots of affordable options out there. You just have to Google and find out. And I also know some therapists offer group therapy, which is also just at a smaller cost or at a lower cost. And there are also community health centers, which I know that offer either free or affordable counseling. Counseling is different than therapy itself, but I think counseling is better than nothing at all. Personally, I believe that my mental health is the fulcrum on which everything else externally stands on in my life, meaning that, if my mental health is in tip-top shape, I'm able to form better connections with people, to show up in my career and work life in a more positive, exuberant way. And so for me, therapy is a priority. The more that I invest into a good therapist and good therapy and good healing work, the more abundance I will reap outwardly. And so I think reframing your mind as thinking that therapy might be too expensive if you can't make it work. There are so many things that we try to make work in our lives financially if we really want it and if we really prioritize it. And so I really think therapy and my mental health are of the utmost importance, and I should be investing in that as much as I can. So I have a very expensive therapist, but to me, a very valuable, a very highly skilled and highly qualified doctor helping me out every single day, or not every single day, but every week, once a week, I would also recommend checking other clinics and other social work programs out there, because there are people who are studying to be a licensed therapist, and they can also help you out with counseling as well. So I think just a really good Google search near you can help you out. Also, there are online platforms like BetterHelp and Talkspace, but I highly recommend going to find the counseling centers or the doctorate, graduate programs in psychology first, because I feel like they are learning the cutting edge techniques and the cutting edge technology and techniques and skills. And Talkspace and BetterHelp, they can be good, but I do feel like it's a very processed way of giving you a therapist. There's not a lot of personalization to it. So the more grunt work you can do in the beginning, I feel like will reap a better outcome in the end. So definitely find a counseling center or a school, or just type in low-cost therapy near me, and that should help you out. Number 3, where to find a therapist. Do not go to Yelp or any place like even Google reviews where you can read the reviews. That is technically unethical and also illegal, because it breaches the confidentiality of patient to doctor or therapist. So if there's reviews, typically ignore that. I highly recommend a good place to start is Psychology Today's Find a Therapist engine. It's a search engine. You can input your filters of what you want. You put in your zip code. You can put your specialties in. You can put in person of color, I believe, a female therapist, and then a bunch of results will come out. That's how I found my therapist. You can also Google nonprofit counseling centers, where I know some therapists do pro bono work, work for free, or they have interns that are doing counseling at work hours, and they can also give you free therapy. So there's a ton of options. You just need to know what to Google. I have my own links and resources down below for you if you live in the Los Angeles, California area that can help you out. I also recommend checking out, these are really commonly used, the American Psychological Association and American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, and the Association of LGBTQ+ psychiatrists. Number 4, the first session and what is the vibe. So prior to your first session, I would highly recommend calling maybe 2 to 3 therapists and having a free on-call or phone call consultation with them. And this is a good time to kind of just pick their brain, what type of work they do, what kind of clients they've worked with in the past, how they might be able to help you, and then you also telling them what your issues are and what you're really seeking out of this experience. And I feel like even just on the phone, you can kind of get an intuitive feeling of who you were gonna vibe with. For me personally, I just knew I really wanted to see this one therapist, so I just booked a call with her, got to my first session, and obviously your spidey senses will be more like in tune when you're actually sitting there in that first session. So when you're in that first session, I want you to think, do I feel comfortable? Do I feel safe? Do I feel seen? Do I feel heard? Do I feel like this person understands me? Can they relate to me? Are they a good listener? Are they someone that I feel like long-term we can work together on my growth goals, or just my goals in general? And I think feeling comfortable and as if you can trust them is really important. But it's also remembering that when you're in therapy, we're also activating a different part of our brain, and trauma work is very heavy work. So a lot of our projections can be heightened at this time. When we're talking about heavy things, we're like, if a person coughs, you're like, oh, this person doesn't care about me. And so also being very aware of how we might project our feelings onto our therapist is important. So being very self-aware. But overall, the first session is really just getting to know each other, and it's kind of like the first date. Do you think you guys can get along? And like I said, even though you might not be friends with your therapist, it's important that you guys both respect each other and can effectively communicate with each other, because talk therapy is all about communication. And then after the session, you can start thinking, do you feel relieved? Do you feel like you can come back again? Do you feel empowered to make a change? Now, therapy is not supposed to make you feel happy or good or amazing all the time. It's actually really difficult, exhausting work, but it's just important. Do you feel heard? Do you feel seen? At the end of the day, do you like them? Do you feel like you can make big changes with them? That's really important to ask after your session. Number 5, types of credential and types of therapy. There are so many different types of therapy. We have CBT, psychodynamic, I think DBT. There's a lot of different types of therapy. For me, because it was my first time going to therapy, I didn't know what to expect. And some therapists will even assign you homework assignments. But for me, we don't really do that. It's kind of like when I asked her what we do, it's a little bit of CBT, life coaching, and working through a deeply spiritual perspective. So I feel like she's been able to tailor my therapy experience to me as a person, because I let her know that, I'm really into, life coaches like Brooke Castillo, and I know about like Gabby Bernstein and spiritual thought leaders. And so I feel like she's been able to tailor my experience. So I didn't really look into the types of therapy when I went. And I also didn't really look at the types of credentials, but I wanted to do a really quick rundown if you are interested in knowing what type of therapist is what. So LMFT, that is a licensed marriage and family therapist. This is someone with a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and 3,000 hours of seeing clients before getting a license. The education focuses on how the individual exists within their family context. Number 2, LCSW, that's a licensed clinical social worker. Same qualifications as above, except their education usually focuses on the struggles of various populations, domestic violence, gender issues, race issues, and they've often worked with nonprofit companies that have some type of cause. Number 3, psychologists, PsyD. These are doctors, and that is a licensed clinical psychologist. They have gotten their bachelor's degree and a PhD in counseling. So it's around 5 years of postgraduate school and a thesis, and they have more of an intellectual and analytical way at looking at clients. And so I work with a doctor. She has a PsyD, and I believe the difference between a PhD and a PsyD, PhD is more research-based, and PsyD is more about working with clients and research with clients, if I'm not too sure. Let me see. Yeah, I think that's right. So yeah, an LPC, LMFT, LCSW, these are all master levels therapists. To me, I think it's just important that all of these people are trained professionals at what they do. They are mental health experts and they can help you out. So I wouldn't get too caught up in the types of therapy or the types of credential the person has unless something's not working for you and you want to seek something else. So that's just a little bit. And then last but not least, how you show up in therapy is how you show up in life. So for me, that meant that when I went to therapy, I was really anxious. I always felt like I had to perform and we had to unpack some deep trauma, and I had to come, and I used to talk at 1,000 miles per hour because I was so anxious. And slowly but surely we started to have therapy sessions on how I approached therapy, and a lot of that was obviously due to my childhood trauma, feeling like I had to be overly self-reliant, had to overachieve. Even in therapy, it felt like a performance, like I had to be the best client and unpack the most. And on the opposite end, I used to have a friend who did nothing but criticize all her therapists to the point where she actually fired a few. And I want to say, keep in mind that while you respect your therapist, you should also be very comfortable with a good therapist who will challenge you, challenge your beliefs, and challenge the way you're living your life, because true change and transformation comes from a perspective shift, and then that will be reflected externally through your decisions and your behavior. So just understand that a good therapist will challenge you, and that's part of their job, right? Because the way we've been operating hasn't been working for us too well. So things need to change, both internally and externally. If you're feeling resistant and if you feel like you don't want to do it, that is how we kind of show up in the difficult areas of our life. How you do anything is how you do everything. And I want a really quick reminder that your therapist is not there to heal you. Just like a physical trainer, if something's not working with a physical trainer and we've hired one, we understand that it's probably us that didn't do the abs right, or that we didn't find the right trainer, the right fit, the one that could put our bodies into shape. That's the same way we should be thinking about mental health trainers, is either they're not a good fit for us, or we're not showing up in the ways that we could be showing up to find the most optimal, effective experience out of all of this. So I want you to keep that in mind, that you are there to heal you. Your therapist isn't there to, your therapist is there to support your healing, but you've got to do most of the grunt work and most of the hard labor and emotional labor that comes with that. And just like how your physical trainer is there to coach you, you're there to do the exercises, and you're there to do the ab crunches and to do the running, the cardio, whatever it is. Same thing in therapy. So I want you to keep that in mind, and I'm so excited for you to embark on this journey. I hope my tips could help you out and help you find a good therapist, and I commend you for this. It's a very, very daunting but fulfilling task to do this for yourself, and it's one of the biggest forms of self-love. So I salute you, and good luck. If you have any questions, let me know down below. I'll try to answer them as best as I can, but I'll see you in my next one. Bye!